You guys, it was this time last week. We're hanging out, about to have donuts. Shout out to KJ and the future Stacy's. Those were delicious, right? Did you guys have them? Yeah. All right. You guys, that deserves a little bit more. I had like 3 that night. I was stoked. But we're here and we're worshiping, and I think I vaguely remember hearing a little bit about the fire, and then all of a sudden you get home, and it's like, holy moly. And by the time we met, many of you came out to the worship night last Wednesday night, and we collectively as a church were praying for LA because it's insane what's happened up there and the devastation that so quickly just burned through that city. And fires like this, unfortunately, we here in SD, we know a little bit about those, but it makes you look a little bit differently at the things you own. As what is yours. In fact, this morning, how many of you guys live in Lakeside? Lakeside people. So I was woken up this morning at like 4:45, 5 o'clock by my wife, and she goes, David, there's a fire. And we open up, you could hear it walking to our front door, and you open up the door, and you see the glow of a fire that was happening like not too far from my house. And in fact, we woke up because you could hear the popping and the crackle of that fire, which for a split second, my wife goes, hey, David, there's a fire. And I'm thinking LA mode, like starting to get all that adrenaline of, is it time? Are we going to have to grab and go? Like we hear stories of, and unfortunately, as I said, many of you and I have friends who have lost their homes like that. Thankfully, it was not that big, like a motorhome caught fire in Lakeside, which is kind of funny, like Lakeside motorhome. But and they got it out real quickly. But like you just think real quickly, what would you grab? What is it that's really of value? What are the things that you're like, this is what I own, and this would make a big difference? And all of those things, like it just makes you reflect a bit. I think about what I personally own, the cars, my house, the what money I have, what clothes I have, what like toys or entertainment, things like that. Like my kids, I don't know that like I own them. That's a weird way to think about it, but I'd want to get them out of the house, that's for sure. I like them. But then that begs the question, this is what I want to talk about a little bit tonight, is what defines ownership? Like, what is it that says, hey, this is mine? So I want to ask you, how would you define something? You're like, this is what it means that I own this thing. Someone tell me. Anyone? Yeah. You purchased it. I bought it. Okay. Natalia? That was it? Anyone else? Yeah. I care for it. Okay. There are some things I care for that I don't own, though, but I still care for them. Yeah, or that. Your name's attached to it. That's Sam. You built it, right? Yeah. You control over it. That's what I think of a bit. Because there are things I care about, but I can't control, right? Sometimes I want to, but I can't. There are things I've built that I've either sold or got rid of, or things like that. There are things I've purchased that I do own, but I own them and now I can control them. I'm in charge of them. You know, it says in Google that the way they define it is the act, the state, or right of possessing something. You have the right to it. But does ownership really mean we're in control? Like I think about like our cars. I have a certain amount of level of control, except my truck, the check engine light went on again. And I definitely, if I could control that, it wouldn't be shining right now, right? You can't control some of the accidents you get into. Like people, there's a level of control I don't have over my car, even though I own it. Our bodies. Man, I am sick again. Last Wednesday, I woke up with this pounding headache and just like, man, I wish there was a market for mucus. I would be a rich man. But like, it's just not, like if my body is my own, like I'm not trying to start a march or anything, but I can't, like there's things over it that I don't have control of. I think about my home or clothes. My clothes constantly need like replacing or things like that, or like jobs. You can even lose those. Like there's a level at which like we own things, but we don't really. Like we own them, but we don't have the level of control that we want to, which is interesting because we spend so much of our lives working so that we can have these things. And often we can let our lives be defined by the things that we, quote, own, and our joy to be defined by the things we, quote, own, and yet we don't really have control to the degree that I think we often want to. And so what I want to talk about tonight is not materialism, although I think maybe that wouldn't be a terrible message, but a mentality that could lead to that or even worse behaviors, worse mentalities. And this idea of ownership I want to talk about, but possessions are the easiest way to describe it. But it doesn't just tie to possessions because there's expectations that we have, there's ambitions we have, dreams, goals that we can own in a way that is very similar to the other possessions we have, and if we're not careful, could even hinder or hurt us. So I want to talk about ownership and how we're often defined by the things we own, but not often in the way we think we are. So if I haven't confused you, don't worry, I'll clarify. But let's get into the word. If you guys have your Bibles, I want to go and talk a little bit about Joseph. Now, help me out. Joseph's one of those stories that I don't know how much you know. So how many of you, raise your hands if you feel like I know Joseph pretty dang well. Like, I know that story. All right. Just how many of you are like, dude, I'm so sick of Joseph's story. All right. No one one person wanted to admit it. I won't point you out. But, okay, cool. I just want to make sure I add the proper amount of context to this. And we're not going to go through the whole story. Don't worry, because I don't want to be here for a couple hours. It says in Genesis verse 37, verse 5, Genesis chapter 37, verse 5 through 7, it says, "Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more." So this I want to give some context to. Joseph is the youngest of 12. Well, technically there's more, but 12 is what we're going to count. And he is his dad's favorite. Now, some of you know who your parents' favorite is, but they've never said it. Joseph's dad was terrible at this. Everyone knew this was his favorite. It was the son of his favorite wife, which that's a whole nother story, a whole nother thing we're not going to get into. But then not only was it the firstborn son of his dad's favorite wife, then he gave this son a special jacket, special coat. Now, if you've taken the Covenant in the Kingdom class here at Foothills, or you've heard me teach at our home group, we've talked about these, like clothing was something, it was very valuable. In fact, you knew someone often by their jacket or their coat or their mantle. That's why when Elijah walked around, people knew from the mantle who he was. And that was for a couple reasons. One, they just didn't have wardrobes like we have nowadays. So you would wear the same thing every day. But often people who were in high positions had coats or mantles or jackets that made them stand out. Well, Joseph, you guys know, had a coat of many colors. It was bright. It was vibrant. So you knew from far away, that's Joseph. That's dad's favorite. And we hate him. His brothers despised him. They did not like him. And it didn't help that Joseph was one of the youngest. And so of all these older brothers who've been around a long time, no dad, and then all of a sudden, this young punk shows up, and he gets all the fancy stuff and all the attention, and they did not like him. So it says here, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said that, "Hear this dream that I have. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." You guys picture that, right? It's like, my sheaf ruled over you guys. It goes on, he says, then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, behold, I've dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Like, it's one thing to say you're a sheath, like you're this like piece of agriculture, but now he's like, the stars are bowing down to me. You see, at 17 years old, Joseph was given this dream that one day it seemed like the way he interpreted it, the way it appeared, is his siblings were going to either bow down to him or he would rule over them. Again, he didn't know the exact context, but multiple dreams, it seemed pretty clear the direction he was going. And I think about this. He's 17 years old, and I think about what happens when I get a dream now at my ripe old age. We talked about that last week. We don't have to, But I run with it. Like, when God gives you this vision for something, and God could give you like this generic vision, but then you take it like 6 steps further, right? That's how we do things. That's how our minds work. So 17-year-old Joseph gets his dream, and he pictures somehow I'm to rule over my siblings, and I'm confident because he's human and I'm human, and we're really not that different, that he's like, as he's doing work, thinking about all the different ways this could potentially play out. And there's danger there. Because when God gives us something, and then we take it a full another level beyond what he's clarified or specified, we could start to own things that aren't ours to own. We could start to expect things that aren't ours to have expectations for. You've maybe heard me talk about this before, but one of my brothers, I have 3, he was given this prophecy when he was in high school that he would lead like David. And in his mind, where he took that was, I'm to be a general in the military. That's not what was told to him, but he took it there. And so then he started pursuing the military, and it started this path that eventually ended with a lot of disillusionment and heartbreak and hurt. But it wasn't the person's fault. It was he started to run with it. And we got to be careful of stuff like that. All that to say, I don't think Joseph was like this punk jerk, like, hey, take this, brothers. Look, see my coat, and I don't think he did that. I think he was pretty naive. I think he just didn't understand like what it would be like for his brothers to hear this. And that's where things got in trouble. It says in verse 23, when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. They took him and threw him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. And then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, and on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? That was the plan. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, he's our own flesh. Guys, let's not kill him. Like, that would be too much. Let's just sell him into slavery. Way better. And his brothers listened to him. Then the Midianite traders passed by. They drew Joseph up. And can you imagine they're like drawing him up, and Joseph's like, guys, that was not a funny prank. And he like finally gets above the pit, and then he sees the traders, and he's like, uh-oh, like what's happening? And they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. I don't think he saw us coming. But all of a sudden, in one afternoon, he loses his family. He loses his coat, which in many ways was his identity. Like it made him stand out as his dad's favorite, as part of that household. And I imagine to some degree there's this question, did I lose out on the promise, that dream that God gave me? Is that gone? In the very least, he has to be thinking, like, what was that even about? Like, how do I make sense of what that message I received and where I'm at now? Ownership can make us question a lot of things. I told you guys last week, my wife and I used to own a photography business. I guess we technically still do. We just don't do a ton of weddings and stuff like that. But in 2017, here's the way it worked for photography is everyone gets engaged between Thanksgiving and like early spring Valentine's Day, basically. And that's when they book their weddings for the fall. And so by springtime, we would know like, hey, it's going to be a good year, not so good of a year, whatever. In 2017, my wife and I in spring looked at each other and we had about 25% of the work booked that we normally would have booked. And so we were in a position where we're like, all right, Lord, what are you going to do? Like, how are you going to move? In fact, it made us, I told you guys last week that me doing ministry was funded. I was able to keep doing it because of our photography business. And so all of a sudden, we don't have lined up the income that we normally would have, and it makes us just start to question, like, all right, we gotta be prepared. We gotta start asking some hard questions. And so some of that was like, all right, what do we need to cut? Are there areas we need to promote and advertise? Are there things we need to reach out to? If this money doesn't come in, what does that look like? Like, what does it look like if we have to go down to one car, if we lose both our cars? What does it look like if like we can't pay our mortgage, or I need to find a different job to make more money? Like, we start asking all of these different questions, and what that does, what adversity does, what challenges do, is it makes you question what is important. Like, you think about the fires that happened and these people that had to run. And I remember in the 2004 and 2007, the big fires that we had here. Again, I had friends that lost homes in both of those. And hearing stories about how they would have you would have minutes and you had to figure out what would you grab. My math teacher at the time, she said, I don't know why I grabbed granola bars and flashlights. And she's like, I don't know what I was thinking, but that's it. And she literally had just minutes and she was out and everything else was burnt. And you think it asks you, it makes you figure out, like, also, what do you believe when it comes to the promises of God? Like, I think about I'm sitting here with my wife and we're looking at the finances and trying to figure out, well, Lord, did you call me into ministry? And this is how you've been providing for ministry. Is this going to question your call? Is this going to shake the call that you have? Is this going to change that? Are you trying to tell? Adversity does that, but ownership does that too, because you have to figure out, are you owning something that you shouldn't own? Are you claiming something that's not yours to claim? Here, let me expand a little bit. It says here, Joseph had been taken, this is Genesis 39:1. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt to Potiphar. And Potiphar was an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the bodyguard bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And so I'm at this place in my life where I'm like, financially, I don't know what it's going to look like. Joseph's here, and he's like, I'm now a slave. I went from being my wealthy father's favorite son to having, now I'm a slave. I don't have anything. And I think about conversations I've had with some of you. There was a young man here who, his plan, his whole life was to go to college and get this degree. And then he found himself at a place where he kept not passing these classes. And he's like, what do I do if I can't go to college anymore? I remember talking to another person who finished school, and he was here, and he's like, I can't find a spouse. Like, I can't find that person I want to be with. I remember talking to another person who physically got into an injury and was just in chronic pain, and that's all they knew. And they were trying to figure out, like I can't do the jobs, I can't even figure out a job I can do without being in pain. Like, we go through stuff where we're not walking out the life we imagine we would walk. And so the question is, are we able to, is our trust still in the Lord who gave us the promises he gave us? And how does that change if the direction that we saw it going can't continue anymore? Or at least not in our vision. Let me say one last thing about this and we'll move on. Any of you guys watch The Walking Dead from years ago? Some of you are like, My wife and I watched it for a few seasons, and it got like crazy. But there's this one episode where these people, remember, it's lawless. And they would walk up, and if you saw something that you wanted, you had to claim it. And so you would just be like, claim. And if you get it, if you claim it, it's yours. But if someone else stole the thing you claimed, the punishment was death. That's how it was. So like you're walking and you see like a strawberry plant. This happened in the show. And one guy goes, claim those strawberries. And so he would go and get them and no one could say anything about it. But if you stole those strawberries later, they would kill you. That's how strict it was. I bring that up because people claim not the promises of God, but they claim the way they think those promises will play out. And there's a slight difference there. There's a slight focus change there. Are you guys with me? It's not the promise of God that I'm talking about, but it's the way we think that promise must be played out in my life. The way we picture God's love and his goodness and his prosperity and all of those things to be played out. And in our mind, we think, well, it must look like this. And then because we claimed the result we expected, when it doesn't plan out for too many people, it leads to this spiritual death. It leads to this place where they're disillusioned and heartbroken and they fall away. And that happens when we own the things that were never ours to own. Whether it's possessions, like, man, God, you wanted me to have this, and then they fall apart. Or whether it's dreams and expectations. What does that say? Are we going to own who the Lord has called us to be or the way we imagined he would bring about that promise? And that's the question for us. That's what Joseph had to figure out here. Was he going to say, God, I trust you? Or was he going to say, God, clearly something's off because I'm not where I want to be. It's not the way I thought it would be. And the first big lesson I want to talk about tonight is this. We're called to release ownership from the things that are not ours to own. We're called to let them go. And I want to tell you, the things that you want to have control over that are not yours to have control over, those we got to let go of. The stuff, but also the aspirations. Having the right perspective of what God wants to do requires us to release ownership from the things we were never intended to own. For Joseph, it meant giving up the idea that he was going to get to God's calling by the way he wanted it to be designed. And I know he did this because of what we read next. In Genesis 39, chapter 4, it says this. Joseph found favor in his sight, that's Potiphar's sight, that's his slave master's sight. He found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer. So Potiphar made Joseph overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. And from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of Joseph, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. And I love this. If Joseph had an unrighteous hold on the dream that God gave him, he never would have served Potiphar. And why does that matter for us? Because look, if we have an unrighteous hold on the things we want to do, the vision we have that God never intended us to have, then we get distracted by that. We get focused on that. And when it goes awry, when it doesn't work, then we get bitter. We get angry. We get resentful. Picture this. Joseph shows up and he goes, God, you abandoned me. Potiphar says, hey, Joseph, I want you to work. How hard is he going to work if he's angry at God, if he's resentful, if he's bitter? He has no motive. He has no intention. He has no purpose to do anything more than the minimum. But he didn't here. He worked hard. And it was because of this. He wasn't serving Potiphar. He was serving the Lord by serving Potiphar. That's the only way that mentality works. That's the only way we get to a place where we, like, if you have a good attitude in a place you don't want to be, it's because there's something greater going on. There's something bigger than that setting. And there's so many people that they allow the settings, they allow their immediate circumstances to be the very thing that defines them. But we as Christians, that's not our call. We are called to be defined by something bigger than any immediate circumstance. We're defined by the Lord. And so when we release ownership, when we say, hey, look, it's not the car I own or the lack of a car I own. It's not the home I have or the lack. It's not the relationship I'm in or the fact that I'm struggling to find a relationship. Like, all of those things aren't the things that are going to define me. But it's the Lord. And it's who he's called me to be. And because if we own those things, then we make idols out of those things. And we give them authority and power in our lives that they never were meant to have. So how do we treat those? We treat those things, we got to be stewards of those things. I want to make sure I'm trying to bust through my notes. And I want to real quickly say this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on stewardship because we talk about it every so often. But many of you know what stewardship is. It's where you take care of something that's not really yours. God has given you something. Here's a way of defining it. Using and managing all of the resources the Lord gives us for his glory and the expansion of his kingdom. But you guys, you've heard that before. But sometimes we need just a slight twist on some of these definitions. So you're like, I've heard about stewardship. But stewardship is not just taking care of the things that God has given you, but it's also releasing the things that you so desperately want to control. If we control them, if we aim to control them, then we let them control us. We let them define us. But when we say, hey, that's not how I'm defined, then they don't hold that power over us. Too many Christians have been sidelined because they let things, possessions, or dreams and aspirations be their idols, be the things that define them instead of the Lord. Let me say this last quote, and I'm going to move on. C.S. Lewis says this in Mere Christianity. He says, every faculty you have, your power of thinking or of moving your limbs from moment to moment, is given to you by God. If you devoted every moment of your whole life exclusively to his service, you could not give him anything that was not, in a sense, his already. Here's the catch. Are we walking that out? When we own the things that we were meant to steward, we diminish and ultimately remove God's involvement in it. Think about this. When you own the things that God called you to steward, you don't go to God to take care of those things because you have control. Your car. How many of you own a car? And before this message, you would say, I own that car. It's mine. And yet, when you steward it, you think, God, this is your car. If there's an opportunity for your ministry to be done in this car, I'm going to let you do it. But how often do we think that way? If you're like me, not enough because I own it too much. We do that in so many areas of our life. But here, let me wrap up with this. With that said, what do we own then? Because I want you to own the right things. There are certain things that you are called to take ownership of And I want to challenge you to do that. And it begins by us releasing the things that we're never supposed to own so that we can grab a hold of the things that God has always wanted you to just take ownership of. Let me show you how Joseph balanced both of these things. It says in verse 7, this is him working for Potiphar. It came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph. And she said, lie with me. Bow, chicka, bow. But he refused. And he said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in this house. And he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one in this house greater than I. And he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. That, you guys, is stewardship. Joseph's saying, this isn't my position, I don't own. Your husband gave me this. All this stuff that I'm in charge of, I don't own it. He's just given me control over it, like he's given me it to steward, but it's for him. But then he says this, but how then could I do this great evil and sin against God? He says, but the thing that I will not budge on, that is mine, that I'm to own, is not only my faith, but my conviction I have to my God. I have control over that. Now get this, because man, I really believe this could change a lot in our lives. We own, like this is my car, this is my dream, this is my job, this is my whatever it is you have. And yet, no, it isn't, because you don't have full control over it, and you don't want it, because if you do, it defines you in a way you don't want to be defined. But it wasn't my fault I sinned. It wasn't my fault because of the situation I was in and the temptation I'm in. Do you see where we go wrong there? We don't own the very things we need to own. That I am called by the living God to walk out like his ways and righteousness and pursue him. We don't own our faith. The very things that we are called by God to own, too often we play victim, or we write it off, or we have all these excuses. And we got these things backwards. That we are called to own our faith. Like it's yours. Too often we say, look, I would be a stronger Christian, but do you know my pastor? And you might have a case here, but no, you don't. It's not, because it's on you. And my prayer is this, my hope, my desire, I really, today, I'm praying earlier today, I was praying during the prayer meeting. Like my hope is that this place would build you up into the men and women that God is calling you to be. But I can't do that for you to the degree that it needs to be done. You got to own it. You got to own your faith. And actually, it's pretty cool. We had a couple people get baptized on Sunday. Well done, owning your faith. Yeah. Were you guys there? I hope you cheered. We have people getting into ministry. We have people pressing in, going to home groups. We have people reading through Scripture, and they're doing the things. You're owning your faith. That is something you're called to own. This is my faith. I'm to run after Jesus Christ. You're called to own your convictions. Like, do the things that God is calling you to do. Walk in righteousness. Don't make excuses. Don't write it off. Don't blame. Don't be a victim. I like blaming other people, right? It's convenient. It makes me feel like I'm not as at fault, but it's not good. It's not right. I think about here at young adults. I want you in many ways to own this ministry. And let me tell you now, you can't own this ministry. Like I can't own this ministry. Like there's certain things about this ministry I can't own and I don't want to own. My prayer this morning was, God, what do you want to do? Because I want always to make room for what God wants to do. I don't want to own this ministry in an unhealthy way. But I do want to own my approach to what I'm bringing. I want to own that, like, I'm going to pray for you guys, and I'm going to pray for this group. I'm going to do whatever I can to crucify my flesh and to die to myself so that I can have a sensitivity to the leading of the Spirit, and the Lord can anoint me to be here. And I want to challenge you guys to own this ministry in that way too. Like, you guys have something to bring into this ministry. And so to some degree, I want you to come and be like, I want to receive. But to some degree, I want to challenge you to own that you have something to bring. You have something to give. You have something to contribute too. I want to ask you, own this ministry in this. I pray that you're praying for this ministry, that you're thinking about it beyond this and asking the Lord, God, I want you to build up what you're doing here. Things like that. Those are things that's the type of ownership we have, where we submit to the Lord and we say, I'm going to follow your lead, but where my faith, where my convictions, where my attitudes, man, we could own those. That's what Joseph did. Man, my attitude would be terrible in that situation. But he's like, I'm not going to let the things I can't control define me. And I'm going to be defined by taking ownership of the things that I can control and giving them to God. In a few weeks, we're going to do a series called All In. And we're going to talk about what it means to really be all in when it comes to community discipleship and purpose. I bring it up because I want to challenge you, as we're running towards that, start preparing yourself for it. I also bring it up because KJ needs some help with some promo we're doing. She might ask you for your picture later. Don't be weirded out by it. And she's going to make you look good, trust me. But I'm really looking forward to that series about what does it look like when we're all in discipleship, all in pursuing God's purposes for our life. Let me wrap up with this, and the band can come up. 1 Corinthians 4:1 says this, this is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Right? And we can own our identity as servants of Christ. What that looks like, not ours to own. But that identity, man, that's mine. I'm to claim that. And when it comes to everything else, the things that I know, the things that I have, man, I want to steward those well. So here's my question for you as we wrap up. What are the things that you're holding on to that you want to control, that you want to own, that God is calling you to let go of? And what are the things in your life that you are not taking claim of, that you are not owning, that the Lord is calling you to own? Are there possessions or even aspirations or dreams that, man, if they don't happen, they're going to shake who you are? And I want to challenge you to give those to the Lord. But are there areas of your life where you've been blaming, God, I'm not doing that because of this person, because of this situation, that you could tonight say, God, I'm no longer going to let those circumstances or those situations be things that I let be excuses, but I'm to own my faith. I'm to own my pursuit of you, and I'm to run after this. I'm going to really press into your word. I'm really going to give up, cut off access to that sin or that person, that bad relationship. I'm going to own this in a way where I'm going to take authority and start running after you. What are the things that you're called to own? What are the things that you're called to release? My prayer is that you would own the right things so that God can move in your life. Will you guys stand up? Let me pray. God, I pray that you would, Lord, I pray you would speak to us directly, individually in this room. Humbly, personally, I pray, God, I want to know the things that I'm holding on to, that I'm letting define me in a way that's unhealthy or unrighteous. Lord, I don't want to have things and take control of them and not give you access to those things, those areas of my life. I pray also, God, may you convict me and my brothers and sisters in this room of things that we can control. Aspects of our faith and character, our attitudes that we're not taking ownership of. Lord, may tonight change that. And we want to do it so that you can be honored. And we want to do it, Lord, so that in your hands we could be malleable and moldable to your purposes. God, you are good. And I don't just say that, God. I know that to the degree that you are good, I can't even understand. But I praise you, Father. And I want your wisdom and your goodness and your ways to rule in my life, in the life of my brothers and sisters here. May you move.